This is our first official presentation from the University of Wisconsin Speakers Bureau. We had an unofficial presentation this past spring, but we're very honored that he came from Madison today to speak to us. Using our new Mimeo board that was donated by the Cable Commission in Prescott. So we're first presentation, so if we have any glitches, please bear with us because this is his first time presenting on the Mimeo as well. So lots of firsts tonight. And I have a little information on him that I'll read, if you will bear with me for a moment. So Kenneth Bradbury is currently the director of the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey and Wisconsin State Geologist. He received a PhD in geology from UWMadison and has worked on groundwater issues in Wisconsin for over 30 years. So please help me welcome Kenneth Bradbury.
Okay, well thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And I should mention that this talk is sponsored by the UW-Madison Speakers Bureau. So your photographer is going to wonder if it's too dark.
Yeah, he just said it was too dark. We don't have a dimmer.
It wasn't that bad with the lights on.
You can turn the lights. That's probably.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay.
Can you guys see?
Oh, yes.
Okay, sure we can.
All right. So anyway, this is sponsored by the UW-Madison Speakers Bureau, and their mission is to send people from Madison out around the state to talk to folks like you. As she said, I'm Ken Bradbury. I work for the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey. We have been for years part of UW Extension, but you may have heard that Extension and Madison are merging, so as of July 1st, we are officially part of UW-Madison now, so there have been a few changes. My talk tonight is called Wisconsin's Geo Heritage, and it's about geology and Wisconsin and sort of how Wisconsin history and geology interacted. It's a fairly general talk about geology and history, kind of a tour around Wisconsin, so I hope you enjoy it. And I'm quite impressed that your library has one of these boards, which I've never used before. So I'm told I just do, let's see, I hit it, something happens.
Did you swipe last time?
I have to swipe. Well, something's supposed to happen. Let's see. It worked before. Do I have to be over here? Oh, how did I
did that.
You did that. Okay.
I think I just woke it up though.
Okay.
So
Maybe you just woke it up. I'm going to show a number of diagrams and figures, and many of them are from this book, Roadside, Geology of Wisconsin, by Robert Dodd and John Addig, who were, Bob Dodd unfortunately recently passed away. John Addig is a emeritus professor from our organization. This is a great book if you're traveling around Wisconsin and you want to know what's along the road, and you can buy it at a lot of bookstores and order it online and so forth. So. But a lot of the diagrams will be from this book. Let's try it. You might have to do it manually. All
right.
Go to the next one. Okay, so I want to get the concept of Geo Heritage because we have a heritage here in Wisconsin of a great landscape and a great state, a lot of resources, and all of this is based on geology. And geoheritage sites, that's a term for sites that have significant scientific, educational, cultural, or aesthetic or scenic value, such as this is a view of the Wisconsin River from a place called Ferry Bluff, not far from Sauk City, Prairie du Sac, if you've ever been down there. And taken by Eric Carson, one of our scientists. So next.
Larry, help!
And here's a woolly mammoth, an art sculpture of a woolly mammoth this is over by the Horicon Marsh. But geoheritage is about our values, the cultural, historic, economic, educational. It means something to everybody. Next. This is Morgan Falls, by the way. up in the Schwabing-Nicolay National Forest. But our landscape is part of our history, so as the settlers came to Wisconsin, the geologic landscape controlled a lot of things about what they did, and I'll talk a little bit about that, things like mining, water resources, agriculture. That was all part of our heritage. And part of the mission of our survey has over the years, we're over 100 years old, as I'll mention in a minute, has been to catalog and map and understand these things. Next. Heritage is our heritage is preserved by things like parks, state natural areas. We have over 600 state natural areas in Wisconsin, historic markers and land, roadside places, museums and collections, and our custom and culture and history. Next. So you guys probably know where this is, not too far from here. The delta of the St. Croix, and a really pretty place where we get an intersection of water resources and geologic resources. Next. And we turn that into a mosaic, and I think of our geoheritage as a mosaic of exploration, science, mining, building, water, agriculture and industry, and recreation and tourism. All these things have something to do with geology. And even the geologic exploration of our state, that's okay, was a pretty exciting thing. And Wisconsin was a pretty wild and woolly place 100 years ago. So I need to give you a little background about geologic time to talk about where we're going to go here. So this is the geologic time scale. And the time scale, these names here are names of different geologic periods, the Quaternary, the Triassic, Jurassic. You've heard of Jurassic Park, that's a geologic time. And this is the age of these in millions of years. So, now it's working, all I have to do is touch it. So this is, I'm calling this the whole scale. It goes back to 4,000 million or 4 billion years. That's the age of the Earth, okay? And you don't have to worry too much about these names, just know that the names are there. So this is age in millions of years for the whole time scale. And over here is what Wisconsin has in our rock history. We are missing large parts of the geologic record, but we have other parts, and it's interesting to a geologist, or should be interesting to you, that we have some important parts of the record. We have the Precambrian rocks here, some of the oldest rocks in North America and even in the world. We have those in Wisconsin, 3,000 million or 3 billion years old. We also have a lot of Paleozoic, what are called Paleozoic rocks, or Silurian Dolomites and Ordovician Dolomites, and you see some of those right around here. Those are around 400 million years old. And then we have a lot of Quaternary materials. These are deposited by glaciers. And so we have a great record of glacially deposited materials, but we're missing some of these rocks here. Either they weren't deposited, or more likely they were eroded away in some ancient landscape. So we're missing records of the Jurassic, the Triassic, and the Permian. We don't have oil, we don't have oil fields here and so forth, which are those kind of rocks host. But we do have a really interesting record of rocks here. Next. Would you do that?
I guess not.
Yeah.
So when this was basically a shallow ocean at one time,
Yes.
that was a Silurian?
Silurian? That would have been, was
Well,
probably around here would have been the Ordovician time. Ordovician. That would have been about 450 million years ago.
Okay.
So, where are these rocks? And so, I'm going to talk about time, and this is a simplified geologic map. Here's a little more complicated geologic map, and we have handouts back there that later on, if you want to have one, you can take one. These different colors represent the different kinds of rock that are present if you could drill down to the top of the rock. Now, a lot of our landscape is covered with sand and gravel and clay from the glaciers, so that if you stripped all that away, this is what the rocks would look like. And so all these colorful rocks are the Precambrian rocks. They're things like granite, schist, and quartzite, very, very old, very hard rocks. The other rocks are sedimentary rocks formed by sedimentary processes like in oceans or rivers or lakes. So I'm going to go through where these rocks are related to time. So the really, what I'm calling really old rocks. Did you do that or did I?
I did.
Great timing. So the oldest rocks in Wisconsin, which I'm going to call really old, are up to 3 billion years old. So that's really old. That's called the Precambrian time, and they cover much of north central Wisconsin. Next. And then I'm just going to call the really old rocks are the Cambrian rocks. And there are these Paleozoic rocks in the blue here. They're like 400 to 500 million years old. And they're some of the rocks, they're the rocks that you more likely see in road cuts around here, but they form a belt around the really old rocks. And they dip off to this is a cross section across the state and cut Wisconsin in two. Some of these rocks dip off to the west, some dip off to the east. In the middle we have this dome of Precambrian rocks. Next. One more. There. And then we have the older rocks, the Ordovician rocks, which are kind of the top here. And then if you keep going, we have the youngest rocks, if you think 400 million years is young, over by Lake Michigan here, the Silurian and Devonian rocks. And so we go from really old rocks to just really old rocks. But it's important to know that there's a huge difference in time from 3 billion years to 400 million years, both old, but quite a bit of time difference. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Next. Now, to digress a minute, a little bit about our survey where I work. We're the Geological and Natural History Survey. We're the only one of those in Wisconsin. Most states have a geological survey that's charged with something like this, doing research inventory and teaching about the rocks, minerals, and water of the state. Our survey is quite old. We date back to 1853. Like most state organizations, we got abolished and reformed a couple of times. Our current structure goes back to 1897. As I said, we're part of University of Wisconsin Extension, but we're moving to UWMadison, and we have a lot of the original geologists that mapped Wisconsin worked for our survey. Next. Down in Madison, one of the things we have, actually in Mount Horeb, which is near Madison, we have a repository of samples. We have core library. These are rock cores. We have them from all over the state. We have over 600,000 feet of rock core there. We have samples from the original early geologists. We have a drill rig we keep there. It's a place people can go and study rock samples. Next. And we have a staff, and we have a web page, and so if you ever, I know some of you may have already done this, but if you're interested in Wisconsin geology, you should look us up on the web. There's our website, or you can just Google Wisconsin Geological Natural History Survey, or even just Wisconsin Geological Survey, and we have lots of publications and maps and things you can download there. Next. And one of the things, for those of you who are interested in minerals and rocks, on our web page we have a couple of pages of all the things about minerals and pictures of minerals and a lot of information. We literally hundreds of different minerals. They're not all from Wisconsin, but if you want to know about minerals for a science project or something, it's a good place to start. Next. And you can drill down on the next page and learn more about a particular mineral and maybe even where it's found in Wisconsin. So just some information we have. So next. So let's hit the road with some old geologists, and this is how the geologists used to do field work many years ago in old cars or in horse-drawn wagons, and they think about that 100 years ago mapping Wisconsin. That was hard work. So let's have a little tour next. So the place, and I'm based in Madison, so I always start around Madison, and the first place we start to go is around Devil's Lake. So those of you familiar with southern Wisconsin, Madison would be down here. Here's the Wisconsin River. Here's Baraboo, and you probably many of you have probably been to Devil's Lake State Park and the Baraboo Range. Really interesting geological place where you can see some really neat rocks. And again, these are pictures out of that Roadside guidebook that I pointed out, so if you ever got that book, you could find out where these things are. So next, one neat place to go is a place called Van Hise Rock. And you may have heard of Van Hise, and Charles Van Hise is the guy who was responsible for what's called the Wisconsin idea. He was also a geologist. He was an early president of the University of Wisconsin. Van Hise Rock is a weird-looking rock by the side of the road, and it's unusual because it shows two very different kinds of rock thrust up next to each other, and you can see one of this side is quartzite, this side is Precambrian. It's much older schist, and that's been folded. And if you go to the next page, there's a plaque there about Van Hise Rock, and this structure here has been used in geology textbooks all over the world as an example of structural geology and uplift of different rocks. And so this is a very famous geological place. And I'll show you in a minute, give you a little more context about what that rock is about. So next.
Does your wand have an on-off switch?
Excuse me?
Does it have an on-off switch?
An on-off switch? No, this is just a...
It actually just told me that the interactive board is not connecting, so I don't know if it has to do with our internet being out or what.
There's no battery in here. So a little more of a cross-section. So where we are is Devil's Lake, and what you see in Devil's Lake is some structural geology. And structural geology means that things have been, the geologic formations which probably started out as flat-lying rocks have been uplifted or folded somehow. And a great place to see that in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, is around Baraboo, where this rock called the Baraboo quartzite, which is very, very old, has been bent into what's called a syncline, and it's got some iron formation like you probably collected in the middle of it, and it's got some rhyolite, a volcanic rock on the outside of it, and it's where its sides are forming what's called the Baraboo Range, and those are the hills that you see around Devil's Lake. And so if you go there now, next slide, and you're at Van Hise Rock, and you turn around, you can see a place called Abelman's Gorge, and a very pretty place. This is a state natural area, and Abelman's Gorge is a place where you've got this Precambrian quartzite, and quartzite is a rock. It started out as like a sandstone. We have some samples back on the table with quartzite, but it got very deeply buried in the earth, and the sand grains slightly melted and fused together to make a very, very hard rock. But Abelman's Gorge is an old quarry where they quarried this stuff, and now there's some big cliffs there. Next slide. And just to give you a little cartoon about what we're looking at now, so this is a cross section across that area. Here's that Van Hise Rock. Whoops. Now can we go back?
I don't know how it's working.
Now you're going forward. There we go. Very good. It's funny, sometimes I just touch it and it moves. So what you see here, Van Hise Rock, and you saw how those beds were now vertical when originally they were horizontal. If you go next to it where Abelman's Gorge is, which would be right here, you see these vertical beds of quartzite, but at the top there's a different kind of rock. There's sandstone, and this is Cambrian sandstone, which is we're going from the very, very old rocks to the very old rocks, and so there's a gap in time of about 1.5 billion years here, and Van Hise Rock is just a small example of that. But if we keep going, next.
You sure you didn't want to try?
Now I'll try it again. If we look at the side of Abelman's Gorge, we can see that this indeed was a sandstone, because you can see these features in there like cross beds. You can see these cross beds which would have been formed when the rock was horizontal, and a current of either wind or water was laying these things down. So these These are called sedimentary structures that show it was deposited in a sedimentary environment. Let's see if I just touch it. Next. And more impressively, you can see ripple marks. So that are now vertical. So this would be like if you went on a beach today, you might see little ripple marks from the waves, but they would be flat. But now they're vertical, and they're very tall. So we know these rocks have been uplifted and turned up vertically. So we know there's been some interesting structural geology going on. Next. And if we look at the edge of the gorge, we can see two different kinds of rock. It may not be obvious now, but next one, Danielle. See this little line here, and so the rocks below that are is the Precambrian or Baraboo quartzite. Above it is the Cambrian sandstone. And so this line is a line of erosion where the quartzite was eroded and then sandstone was deposited on top of it something like 1 billion years ago. So you're looking at this would have been a landscape, an ancient landscape 1 billion years ago, which I find quite fascinating to think that this was deposited, and then there was many, billions of years of time while it was eroded down, and then another sea came in and deposited more sandstone on top of it. Now to see a little more of that in action, we need to go to a different place. So next, we'll go over to a place called Parfrey's Glen. Who's been to Parfrey's Glen? Anybody? You got to go to Parfrey's Glen. I'll show you why. Parfrey's Glen was State Natural Area number 1. If you've been to Devil's Lake State Park, it's not very far. And the place we just were with Hise Rock is over here, a place called Upper Narrows. You can drive over through the town of Baraboo over to Parfrey's Glen. Parfrey's Glen is an ancient stream. Next. And so Parfrey's Glen is this really pretty canyon cut into the sandstone, cut into Cambrian age. That's like 500 million year old sandstone. Next. And if you walk up Parfrey's Glen, here's what you see. This is a cartoon. What you see here is two kinds of rock. You see the lighter stuff, which is sandstone of Cambrian age. Within it are these purple quartzite pebbles, and those quartzite pebbles came off of the Baraboo quartzite over here, which would have been a sea cliff in the Cambrian Ocean, again, 500 million years ago. So you can imagine an ancient landscape where water waves were crashing on the shore, breaking off boulders and pebbles, and they were running down the stream. So next slide. If you go to Parfrey's Glen, this is what you see. You see the walls of this made of sandstone, but then all these rocks in it are Precambrian quartzite, way older than the sandstone, which is very old itself. So again, you're seeing two different eons of geology merging together there. Next. And it's a really neat place. It's a great hike to take up the creek there. And now let's go over and just take a look at Devil's Lake and see a similar thing. How many have been to Devil's Lake? Yeah, that's a great state park. So next one, Danielle. So Devil's Lake is close by. Here's Devil's Lake. And when if you've been to Devil's Lake, you notice all this talus, these rocks falling down the slope. Those are all the Baraboo or the Precambrian quartzite that's been breaking off of these cliffs. So these hills are made of quartzite. If we take a little hike up to a place called Elephant Rock, though, on the North Trail, here's Elephant Rock, and it's a little bit of a hike from the north office there at Devil's Lake, if you've ever been there. And here you can see what's called the Great Unconformity, the place where the Precambrian quartzite and the Cambrian sandstone meet. And because in the middle you've got quartzite, here you've got sandstone, in the middle you've got quartzite pebbles and boulders that are incorporated into the sandstone. So again, you've got an intersection of two different worlds. A world of 1 billion years ago and a world of 500 million years ago. And this rock was eroded and some of it was incorporated into these rocks up here, which is a pretty fascinating thing to see. And it shows you there was a huge gap in time there. And as long as you're at Devil's Lake, you got to turn around and look at the beauty of it. It's a really pretty place, particularly in the fall. So if you haven't been there, you should go. Have your parents take you sometime. Next. So those have been I've been talking about the really, really old rocks. Now let's move up to the really old rocks, which are still old but quite a bit younger. Next. And these would be the Cambrian sandstones that we see in central and western Wisconsin. This is called the Walk sandstone. This is a big outcrop that you may have seen on Highway 14 near La Crosse. So this sandstone was laid down either by wind or water or some of each in huge quantities over central Wisconsin. Next. And if you look at that under a microscope, it's a really what geologists call a really well-sorted sandstone, because all these sand grains, this is under a microscope, are well-rounded and they're about the same size. And so it forms a very good aquifer that I'll talk about in a few minutes, because water can pass through these really well. In outcrop, a typical sandstone looks like this. You can see these cross beds. This shows us it was deposited in a sedimentary way by wind and water. Next. And so you can think of it as a deposit on an ancient beach. And so the type of environment we think of that sandstone coming from would be something like this. A beach, near shore environment where there'd be currents and waves along the beach that would maybe make those ripple marks. Or there might be wind, and some of it could be from sand dunes, and probably a little bit of each from our Cambrian sands. So Wisconsin was a seashore at one time, and then and as the land went up and down, the place where the beach was moved back and forth, and we can kind of map that out in our work and by looking at these sedimentary structures. But today, move along. You can see these sandstones in some really interesting outcrops. This is a place called Rockbridge, which is down in southwest Wisconsin, where there's it's a little city park with this nice outcrop of Cambrian sandstone, but in this case there's a tunnel right through, so you can walk on this little bridge right through the sandstone. This is a place called Rabbit Rock in central Wisconsin, and there's a lot of these what are called Cambrian sandstone mounds, or there's Rocha Cree, Target Bluff, a few things like this where the sandstone was a little more resistant to erosion, and so these did not erode away as much as the sandstone around it. Think of it historically that all the sandstone in central Wisconsin would have been the same level, and there would have been sandstone that thick everywhere. It eroded away, and that's why we have so much sand in central Wisconsin now. But these high places were left behind, and so you drive through central Wisconsin, you see some of these sandstone bluffs. Target Bluff along the interstate is one people have seen. Next. And of course, the sandstone has led to an important industry, the frac sand industry, which I know south of here and around here is a pretty big deal. This is a map of where those sandstone formations are near the surface in central and western Wisconsin, and all these red dots are places that at least a couple of years ago there were active frac sand mines. And again, frac sand is used by petroleum industry, and to help them produce more petroleum, they inject the sand into the well, and it helps hold fractures open down in the oil producing horizons. We don't do any oil drilling here, of course. We only have the sand. We don't do any fracking here. We just produce the sand, and this is shipped all over the United States to be used by petroleum companies. Next. Now, speaking of mining, Wisconsin has a great legacy and history of mining, including not only frac sand, but lead and zinc and copper and iron. So this is a picture of a Galena Vein, or lead zinc ore, down near Platteville, where we had our southwest Wisconsin mining district. Next. And that was a very famous area for lead mining in the early 1800s, because a lot of the ore deposits were near the surface, and one of the reasons we're called the Badger State is that the early miners would dig shallow holes, which were called badger holes, to dig ore deposits out, and the Native Americans used ore deposits too to make tools and jewelry and so forth. The early lead mining was pretty rough. You know, they would have these shafts, and they would have a windlass, hand-operated windlass, and they would lower people down and have a vertical shaft. And if you go down near Shoalsburg or Platteville now, there are a couple of museums where you can see how this was done in the early days, and later on, it became much more mechanized. Speaking of heritage, in the 1830s, miners from Cornwall, England came to work those mines because the mining in England had kind of petered out and they knew how to mine, so they came, and this is an example of geology driving settlement, because they brought their food, the Cornish miners brought their food, their customs and so forth, and so if you go down to a place called Shake Rag Alley down by Platteville, there's a lot of Cornish history down there, and northern Wisconsin too had Cornish miners. During the First and Second World Wars, more industrial mining took off in southwest Wisconsin. We had these large industrial mines down near Shoalsburg and Cassville. And they were big operations. They're all gone now, even though there was still ore there, but they couldn't make money anymore. But most of the bullets for the Civil War were made from lead from southwest Wisconsin. Interesting little fact. And those mines were quite active up until around the 1960s, when many of them started going out of business. There aren't any mines active there now, but historically that was quite a big mining area. Next. We also have a history of iron mining in the state, and here's a picture of some taconite ore or banded iron formation, which would be a very heavy rock. Found this kind of thing they mine up in the Iron Range in Minnesota, but it's found in parts of Wisconsin too. And a lot of people don't realize that iron mining has occurred in southern Wisconsin around Ironton and Sauk County, or Baraboo, over in Dodge County around Mayville. There was a huge mine at Black River Falls called the Jackson County Iron Mine, and then we had mining up in the Gogebic district in northern Wisconsin. So a big history of iron mining in our state. Next. So this is a picture of the Jackson County Iron Mine, which a lot of people have forgotten about, but it's not far from Black River Falls. This was a huge open pit mine that was something like 300 feet deep, and it was active up until the early 1970s, when it was when they stopped mining there and they let it fill with water. So now it's a lake. It's Lake Wazee County Park. It's a really interesting example of a mine reclamation project where now there's a pretty nice lake there that's really deep, and it's a mecca for scuba divers because the water is very clear there. So if you ever go to Lake Wazee, you're swimming in an old iron mine. Now farther north in Wisconsin, we had the Hurley iron mines, and this was a pretty big deal. These were very deep underground mines, sometimes as much as 1,000 or more feet deep, and they were mined for many years for iron ore that didn't get shipped out through the Great Lakes. This is an example of a core, and this thing is like 5 or 6 feet across from Hurley, Wisconsin, from one of the mine shafts there. And mining is still a controversial thing. It was a little bit controversial back in those days too, although it was a very important source of employment for people. Next slide, please. And this was 1886, the Chicago Tribune, and I know you can't read all this, but it talks about the mines as a newly developed bonanza up in northern Wisconsin, and how the theaters, banks, saloons, and electric lights have come because of mining there, and how it's going to be changing the landscape. And the same sort of things we talk about now were going on over 100 years ago. People were concerned about mining, but they also liked the jobs that it brought. Next. Now, one of the things, we don't have internet here, so I won't try to show this to you, but one of the things we've done at our survey is we've collected all the data from the old iron mines and put it into a website called the Lake Superior Legacy Collection. And in that collection, you can look at rock samples and things called thin sections, where they would slice a rock very thinly so the light passes through it. That's one way we study rocks. And even notes from the early geologists from what's called the Lake Superior district. So this would be Minnesota, and then I went around to Wisconsin here. So we have another type of data that we have at the survey on our website. Next. So, of course, another mineral that we mine in Wisconsin is dolomite. And we quarry dolomite for dimension stone. Dolomite is the kind of rock, dolomite or limestone, that you might see in road cuts around here. And particularly in eastern Wisconsin, the dolomite quarries were quite important for building stone for Milwaukee and Chicago, and for building roads and highways. So there are some big old quarries in eastern Wisconsin. Next. And if you go to Door County, this is a big, what's called the Big Quarry Park at Sturgeon Bay. This is just outside the city of Sturgeon Bay, but all this big outcrop here, that was just a big dolomite quarry, and they would put big blocks of dolomite on ships here in the harbor, and they would ship them down to Chicago and build buildings and bridges and everything that was used, that this rock was used for. So that was a big industry. Again, it's still a big industry, but it's not, we don't ship it so far anymore. It's mostly local now, mostly local use. This particular quarry is closed. One of the things they did with dolomite is they would burn it in these lime kilns, and they would make cement and plaster and fertilize, lime for fields and so forth. So when you burn limestone, you can make lime and with these lime kilns. So that was an industry related to geology. Now, as long as we're in eastern Wisconsin, I wanted to point out all the neat things that you can see over there on the other side of the state from here. But each of these little red triangles is some kind of geologic spot of interest as we go up the Niagara Escarpment. Now, the Niagara Escarpment, which ends up here in Door County, is there because we have these Silurian rocks, Silurian age limestones or dolomite that are somewhat resistant to erosion. I'll show you on the next picture. So these rocks, as I said, the rocks on the east dip off into the east toward Lake Michigan, and so those very, very old rocks are down here, and then we have these kind of layer cake on top of these younger rocks that are dipping off to the east if you go over toward Lake Michigan. And these purple here are the Silurian rocks, or the dolomites, and they are at the surface, and because they're a little more resistant to erosion, they form an escarpment called the Niagara Escarpment, which is the same escarpment that wraps around the Great Lakes and forms Niagara Falls. And because they dip the way they do, they form a steep cliff on the west side and a gentle cliff on the east side. So next picture. Oh, and before we get to the next picture, and they have a lot of fossils there because the Silurian Sea was rich with life. It would be like going to the Bahamas or off of Florida today. There were a lot of marine life living at the Silurian time, 350 million years ago. Simple life forms, but they tended to leave behind fossils. So next picture, if you look at the rocks, you can often see fossils there, and you can probably find some of these fossils around here too. We have things like corals, which would be like this honeycomb-shaped stuff, brachiopods, trilobites, our state rock. Again, I touched the screen and it moved.
I didn't do it that time.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mentioned the cliffs. So if you go to Door County, on the Green Bay or the west side, we have these tall cliffs. This is a Peninsula State Park, and this is all the Silurian dolomite, and you can see it's a fractured rock. It's dolomite and limestone are quite similar to each other, and the rocks are dipping off to the east. Let's see if I try to do it. It doesn't work though. But if you go, we go right across the county to the other side here. This is called Cave Point, and you can see here there's not a big cliff, and that's because we're on the down dip side of these rocks, and so we have a small cliff. This is a beautiful place to come because there's waves crashing here from Lake Michigan. But these are the same rocks that you see on the other side, except there's not a big cliff there, and that's because of the way the rocks are dipping regionally. They dip out toward Michigan and go under Lake Michigan. But it's kind of a neat place to visit. If you're in Door County and you go down to Sturgeon Bay, it's a pretty place. Next slide. But it's also the eastern terminus of the Ice Age Trail. And the Ice Age Trail follows the edge of the glaciated part of Wisconsin all around the state. And it starts right up here, not far from us, in Interstate Park, and it ends in Door County at Potawatomi State Park. But this gives me a chance to talk about glaciation for a minute. So next. So the youngest geologic formations we have in our state are these glacial deposits. And Wisconsin, about in the last million years and in the last 100,000 years was covered partially by ice. And this ice came down in various lobes from what's now Canada, and it came down in these different lobes. The Green Bay lobe was the largest, and the Lake Michigan lobe here. The lobe came down Lake Michigan, went down through Green Bay, and then there were these other lobes. Over here we'd be in the Superior or Chippewa lobes. And then there's a large area in southwest Wisconsin where the ice did not reach, and that's called the driftless area. So if you've been down there, you see the landscape is a little more hilly. We have these coulees and so forth. That's because it wasn't glaciated. The Ice Age Trail follows the edge of these glacial lobes from Door County, generally around over here to Interstate Park. So some people I've talked to have hiked the whole thing, but it's a really interesting trail full of many glacial features. Here you can see how this Laurentite ice sheet covered parts of Wisconsin and over in Illinois and Ohio. It actually moved farther south and Minnesota as well. But we have this driftless area in southwest Wisconsin where the ice did not reach. The other thing it did is dammed up some lakes. I'll get back to that. We know the ice was here because we can often see scratches. These are called glacial striations, where a glacier was moving across some of these rocks and leaving these scratches. So think of these scratches. These are probably 50,000-year-old scratches. And by looking at the scratches, geologists can tell us the direction of ice movement. It's kind of a tracer for the ice movement. Next. And if you have a chance to get down here to southeast Wisconsin, Waukesha County and Walworth County, you're in what's called the Kettle Moraine, interlobate moraine, or what we just generally call the Kettle Moraine. And the reason the Kettle Moraine is there is because we had this lobe that came down Lake Michigan and a lobe that came down Green Bay, and in between they met and they left behind lots of interesting glacial features, kind of near the cities of West Bend and down here to Walworth and so forth. And so the Kettle Moraine is a really interesting place to go, and you see a lot of glacially deposited features. Next. And a couple of examples are drumlins. This is obviously taken from an airplane, but you see this sculpted landscape, and it's hard to see this from the ground, but from an airplane, and if you're ever in an airplane, take a look, and when the light's right, you see that you can kind of imagine how the ice was going over this area and sculpting the landscape. And so these hills are called drumlins. There's ice streamlined topography from the ice moving over the landscape and making these interesting hills. Sometimes roads cut right through them. You might drive along that road and you might not know you're looking at a drumlin, but from the airplane you can see that. Interesting landscape. Next. And if you go to the Kettle Moraine, you can see other features. This is an esker, this interesting hill, this snake-like shaped hill. An esker is a place where when the ice was there, a stream was running along the ice. Okay, so think of this area covered with ice, and then you have a meltwater stream on the top of the ice. And as the stream ran along, it deposited a lot of sand and gravel along its course. Later on, the ice melted, and all of this topography collapsed. And so the place the stream was now becomes the hill of sand and gravel. and this is called an esker. We have some very, very famous eskers in eastern Wisconsin. Some of their textbook, they're used in textbooks around the world as good examples of glacial topography. And there are many other glacial features in eastern Wisconsin that are worth looking at in the Kettle Moraine. Next. So now let me talk about the water a little bit. Well, I'm a hydrogeologist by training, so I'm pretty interested in water, worked with water my whole career. Wisconsin is a pretty wet place most of the time. We have a great heritage of groundwater and world-class aquifers. Remember that availability of water was certainly critical to the settlement of the state. And it controlled where people lived and what they did. Next. And just to remind you of something about water, and particularly groundwater, where does water come from? It's all part of the water cycle, which starts with rain and snow, like we might be having out here, maybe now or very soon. Rain on the landscape. What happens to that rain? Well, some of it runs off and becomes part of a river or something. A lot of it evaporates. It becomes part of, it evapotranspires, it becomes, is used by plants or trees. And some of it, a little bit of it infiltrates and becomes groundwater and moves through a groundwater system. It might get intercepted by a well here, or it might discharge to a lake or a river or stream, and then it all ends up back in the atmosphere. So we have a closed system of the water cycle here. And an aquifer is just a geologic unit like a sand or sand and gravel or a sandstone that can transmit water to a well. Okay, and so one of the things I do is I study aquifers. Next. And the reason we care a lot about groundwater, not only do we drink it, but it sustains springs and wetlands in the state. This is the Mink River, another interesting spot in Door County, but these are all springs sustaining this wetland complex, and there's endangered species that live there, and there's, it's a really neat place to visit also. Kind of a wet place to get your feet wet if you walk around there. Next. So just a little bit about our aquifers in Wisconsin. I've told you something about the rocks, but we have really 4 main aquifers, and 3 of them are on here. We have these Precambrian or crystalline rocks, and if you want to see what those look like, the dells along the Eau Claire River, that's an example of the fractured crystalline rocks in northern Wisconsin. They're not particularly great aquifers because they're not very porous. They do have cracks and fractures in them that the water can move through. Over much of the state, we have these Cambrian sandstones, like you might see at the Wisconsin Dells here, if you take the boat trip. And that's a great aquifer, and most of our major cities like Madison and Waukesha, La Crosse, are using water from that aquifer. And then in eastern Wisconsin, we have this dolomite that you might see in Door County. And many of the shallow wells in this area are getting water from this dolomite. So those are the 3 kinds of aquifers. And then on top of that, we have sand and gravel. And sand and gravel is a pretty important aquifer, but it's not continuous. It tends to be kind of spotty and deepest are along rivers like the Wisconsin River here and along the Mississippi. And then much of northern Wisconsin has some kind of sand and gravel aquifer over it. But you can see that this would be a really great place to get water where it's below the water table. The problem with the sand and gravel is it's not continuous, and so it's a place, some of these small pockets of sand and gravel may not contain enough water to really sustain a well for a long time. And then there are places like Door County where you have little or no sand and gravel present. Next. The sand and gravel aquifer, one of the major places it occurs is central Wisconsin in the central sands, where it's used for irrigation for potatoes and vegetables through these high capacity wells, which is understanding how much water those use and how that water use affects lakes and springs and wetlands is one of the things we study. Next. You may have seen a flowing well before. Flowing wells are often called artesian wells were commonly found in eastern Wisconsin and western Wisconsin. They're usually at low places along the landscape. So around here you might find an artesian well along the Mississippi River, for example. An artesian well just means it's a well where the water is flowing out naturally with no pump, and that's because it's the end of a groundwater flow system, and that water, which is flowing from a higher place to a lower place, gets a passageway to the surface through this open well. And where you find artesian wells, you also find springs as well. And springs were places where people liked to settle because it was a great place to have a homestead in the old times. Flowing wells, I think, are a pretty interesting feature. And things have changed. This was in the city of De Pere, right near Green Bay, this was a flowing well drilled in 1890. And I don't know if you can see this, there's a geyser here. Well, the top of the water is flowing way up there, and you can see people in their raincoats and their umbrellas. It was a pretty big deal. This is right in downtown De Pere. And there were artesian conditions throughout eastern Wisconsin where if you drill deep enough, you would get a gusher like this. Now, over the years, we've used so much water that doesn't happen anymore. But historically, it did. And De Pere wasn't very big back in 1871. Springs are pretty important in Wisconsin. We've done an inventory and we found over 10,000 mapped springs across the state. Springs were a source of water for many people. In fact, in Waukesha and in other places, bottled water from springs was a pretty big industry. And this is a guy drinking from the Bethesda Spring back in 1908. And it was we have conflicts over water now. We had conflicts back then. Next page. Waukesha, which is over by Milwaukee, it's still known as Spring City. And that's because it had historically many springs there. It was known as the Saratoga of the Midwest. Now Saratoga is Saratoga Springs, New York, and they're famous for bottled water, spring water there. And at the time, Waukesha was known for its spring water spas. People traveled long distances to enjoy the water, and many people felt it had healing properties and so forth. They bottled it, and it was quite an industry. Unfortunately, now with urbanization, most of these springs have been either gone dry or they've been paved over, so they're not there anymore. But it was back 100 years ago, it was a pretty big deal in Waukesha. And it's quite interesting. Next slide. That it was valued so much that Chicago tried to steal it from us. In the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, there was a plan to pipe water from Waukesha down to Chicago for the Chicago World's Fair. And it was, interestingly enough, it was very strongly opposed by Waukesha residents who thought Illinois was stealing our water. And this is an old newspaper political cartoon that shows Chicago is the big hog here, and all the local politicians trying to kill it because they were going to steal our water. And here you see a picture of a train, and that train was a protest train that came from Milwaukee or Waukesha to the capital, Madison. Next slide. To people that were protesting the use of a pipeline from Waukesha to Chicago. And so we have protests now in Madison, and that's nothing new. In 1893, you can see there was a train that came in, a special Waukesha train in Madison to fight granting a franchise to pipe spring water to Chicago, and it says no pipeline. So, it's interesting how political turmoil doesn't change that much. Next. Springs were a pretty important place, and I love this picture because this is near Mount Vernon, Wisconsin, a place called Big Spring, and this was taken in the 1880s. The whole town, Mount Vernon is maybe 10 miles southwest of Madison. It's just a little tiny town. In the 1880s, you can see everybody got out by the spring. There's a brass band. Ladies all in their Sunday clothes, everybody's dressed up for a town picture. That spring is still there, next picture. And now it's a park along, you can see this is where they were standing, and now the the town doesn't come out there anymore, but it's still a great spring. It's one of the largest springs in southern Wisconsin. But it just shows you how highly the people valued the spring. Next slide. So this, okay, we got a little video here of one of the things we've been doing with the survey is a statewide spring survey, and just to show you how dynamic springs can be, this is some underwater photography just showing the boiling sand from the water coming up. And look carefully at springs, you may see something like this. I just think it's pretty neat to see groundwater in action. Next. So just to kind of summarize here, Wisconsin geology has had a pretty profound influence on Wisconsin's history and past and on our future. This is an outcrop over near La Crosse, I think. We think of all the things we use rocks for. Building stone, we get water out of them, we get minerals out of them. All the wallboard in your building, that's all made from rocks. Metal, all the metal we use comes from rocks. The energy we use for our lights comes from rocks. All the material in your cell phone or your camera or your car battery, it all started out as a rock somewhere. So it's important to understand why geology is important, why it's important to know about it. Next slide, which I think is the final one. These are the ice caves along Lake Superior a couple of years ago. Our Geo Heritage is with us all the time, and take advantage of it. We have a beautiful state, and get out there and enjoy it. And I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should say I brought a few materials I gave to the library here. They're back on the table, and you guys can do whatever you want with them.
Thank you very much. And we also brought samples.
Yeah, there's some rock samples there.
There's some rock samples back on the table back there. Thank you very much for that amazing presentation. And you braved the winds that are pounding on the window.
Oh, okay.
We have a few warnings, weather warnings that I'm going to show you my phone if you can see it, because we're under a hot pink radar cloud right now. So I would recommend asking questions and staying there. We don't have internet either, so that's not working.
So happy to ask anybody have a question?
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
So Ken,
Bob, right?
yes. The cycle of water, it's continuous. And I've heard at one point in my life, I'm too old to remember, but we are drinking the same water that the dinosaurs drank, basically.
Well, yeah, essentially. No, because it's been cleaned a few times.
Because of
but yeah.
Well, my question is if it keeps recycling, why are the the wells or whatever, why are they drying up? I mean, what?
Well, because the water, it doesn't always end up in the same place. In other words, the amount of water in the world, in the globe, is about the same, but it's not all distributed the same way. So, for example, water can evaporate one place, and it doesn't necessarily rain back exactly there. It drifts off somewhere else, or we harvest, we bottle water and we truck it off and something else, it goes somewhere else. So, for example, here's a great example. It's down in Madison. Madison, this little city, is on groundwater, as are most cities in Wisconsin. Almost everyone's drinking groundwater except for cities right along, like Milwaukee, that are right along the lakes. But in Madison, we use groundwater. There are something like 25 high-capacity wells that serve the city. They pump 50 million gallons a day of groundwater. What happens to that water? Well, everybody uses it and they bathe or whatever. It goes down the drain. Most of it goes down to the sewage treatment plant that cleans it up. Where do they put it? They don't put it back in the ground. They put it in the Yara River. The Yara River goes out of Dane County. So we take groundwater out of the ground, put it in the river, and it goes somewhere else. The amount of water in the world isn't changed, but the amount of water in Dane County changed, because now that water is going down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the way we use water redistributes it. And just like, if we have, we have a lot of, climate gets colder, for example, or it gets warmer, we change the amount of ice in the Arctic, and that water is either melting or freezing, and that's going to affect sea level. So all these things interact. Total amount of water is probably not much different. We lose some water to space, we gain a little more water from volcanoes. Interestingly enough, a lot of water vapor comes out of volcanoes, and even undersea volcanoes, or even the kinds that are in Hawaii, there's water vapor in that vapor that's coming out. That replenishes some of the Earth's water. But overall, we're pretty much at steady state.
Okay. I had heard that we're, the same amount of water, basically.
Yeah.
And I didn't put two and two together that we're putting it down the river.
We're moving it around, yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes?
I was just wondering how common it is to find cephalopod, fossil, and a reef builder in this area.
In this area, well, I have to say I haven't looked at fossils right around here. You ought to be able to find some fossils, cephalopods, and what's the other, reef?
A reef builder?
Well, reef builders are, almost everything can be a reef builder. Corals or brachiopods, when you look at, well, for one, here's something to do. Go on our website. We have a page about fossils, and so if you go on our website, it may tell you where in Wisconsin you're likely to find things. But if you go to an outcrop, look at like a road cut or something. Look at the, you may not find fossils everywhere, but those different beds are going to have more or less fossils depending on where you look. So you might have to look carefully. Or if there's a local gem and mineral club around here, which it probably is, I don't.
Maybe.
You can Google that.
Right.
Those people are probably pretty aware of where you could look for local fossils.
Well, I have a couple of each that I found around here.
Yeah, so it's not.
I just didn't know if it was rare to find.
It's not that rare to find them. I mean, it's a little rare to find really good ones. A lot of them are kind of beat up and weathered, but if you find a really good one, that's kind of lucky. Yeah.
So do we have dolomite here or limestone?
We have a little of each, and the difference is, it's kind of a continuum. Limestone is calcium carbonate, dolomite is magnesium carbonate, but the calcium and magnesium kind of mix. So most of the rocks are what we call a calcium magnesium carbonate, and they would be somewhere between a pure dolomite, which would be magnesium, and pure limestone, which would be calcium. So in one outcrop, you may go from a more dolomitic part to a more limestone part. By and large, it was mostly on the dolomite end of that, though. So it's more dolomite. But
Is there a way to tell the difference?
If you have a little bottle of acid, the limestone is going to be more. If you drop it on the rock, it's going to fizz. The limestone is going to be way more fizzy than the dolomite.
Okay.
And often the dolomite is a little more grayer than the limestone, but not always. So, but that's a good way to tell. Yeah.
Why was the spring boiling?
Okay, good question. Why was the spring boiling? Well, it wasn't boiling because it was hot. It was boiling because the pressure of the groundwater coming up was enough current to move the sand around and disrupt it. So there was actually a current or a spray of water coming up.
So instead of heat, it was pressure.
It's pressure, yeah. And you've probably heard of quicksand.
Yeah.
Anybody remember the Lone Ranger? You guys do. You've seen the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger was always getting stuck in a spring. He was always having to. Tonto would throw the rope across, and the Lone Ranger would try to not get stuck in the quicksand. The problem is, you can't die in quicksand because the quicksand is always more dense than your body. You could maybe get stuck, but you're not going to drown. So quicksand is just a place where the sand is boiling up because the water pressure is lifting the sand grains apart. That's what quicksand is. But when you take engineering geology, a common experiment they do is they make some quicksand in the lab and they drop like a little doll or something and prove to you that it's not going to sink and die. Yeah.
Okay, so what is geocaching?
Geocaching, well, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with geology, but geocaching, geo just means the world, but it's kind of related to geology. Geocaching is when people, now that we have GPS and people have smartphones, people hide things out in the world somewhere, and they can give clues, and often it's like often there'd be like a little box with some, like a little trinket or even a note or something in there, and it's hidden under a tree stump, or sometimes it's in a city under a building, and you then have an adventure with your smartphone and your GPS of trying to find it. When you find it, you can either take something and put something else back, or you sign your name, or you make a record of it. So it's a fun thing to do. Get you out in the world, and often, some of them are really, really difficult to find. Other ones are quite easy. But if you go online, you can find all kinds of stuff about geocaching. Yes, sir.
Slide around here, Lake Superior and the Apostle Islands. And one of the islands on the boat tour we were on, the man pointed out way up, a couple 100 feet up from where we were, looked like sea caves. So Lake Superior was bigger.
Yeah, the lake levels have changed, and if you look at the history of the Great Lakes, the lake levels have gone up and down, and one of the records sea caves are a good record of that. Another would be ancient shorelines. I mean, we can look and you can see beach ridges and things that are either higher than the water now or sometimes lower. If you've been to anybody been to the ridges in York County? The ridges. Well, there's a place called the Ridges Nature Center, which is near Bailey's Harbor. A whole lot of beach ridges there from older stands of Lake Michigan. But yeah, high level sea caves along Lake Superior would be a record of higher lake levels in the past. And there's a whole as glaciation came and went, water got locked up in ice, and then it got released, and then of course there were ice dams as the ice blocked different drainage ways, and so that caused the lakes to go up and down as well. It's a fascinating history, and they're still unraveling it now. Yes?
We have Crystal Cave here over in Spring Valley. Is that formed from water being underground?
Crystal Cave there are actually a number of cave or karst features around here, and that's formed by water dissolving the rocks. The dolomite and limestone are rather soluble or somewhat soluble with rainwater, and as over the thousands of years water running through those, starts out as a crack and it gets wider and wider, and pretty soon you have a cave. So yeah, those are caused by water. And that's actually also an area where groundwater is very vulnerable, because where you have rapid groundwater flow in these caves, it's very easy to have contaminated wells because there's no filtration from the soil and so forth. Water can move very rapidly. So that places you have caves, often the water quality is very vulnerable to contamination from surface activities. Yeah.
I'm a nerd with agates, so I can't stop looking for them. I actually have a problem. I have too much rock.
You haven't got the right shirt on, too.
Yeah, right. Right shirt on. But is the Superior agate the oldest type of agate? I heard something like that. I don't know if it was true, but
I wouldn't think it's the oldest type of agate.
Okay.
They're old, but I don't think it's. I mean, agates.
I hear things from other people.
Yeah.
I don't really know.
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
But I have to say I'm not an agate expert. Here, I saw you got your Packers hat on, so here's a little interesting tidbit about the Packers in geology. The Packers were in Green Bay, and I think it was when Curly Lambeau was still the coach. He wanted the team to have a practice area. So halfway up Door County, there was an old monastery on the Green Bay side that went out of business or whatever, and he bought that. He had the team buy that as a training center, and and it was halfway up Door County. Now, Door County, as I showed you, is dolomite with very thin soil, and that meant that the ground was really, really hard. So they built a maybe it was the Lombardi years. I can't remember if it was Lambeau or Lombardi, but they helped build a practice football field there, and the players would live in this. You know, they got them out of the den of iniquity of Green Bay and up to the wilds of Door County, and they're all living in this monastery. But the players hated it because the ground was so hard and they kept getting hurt. And the Packers had, I think they trained there 2 years and they had lousy seasons. And then the next year the place mysteriously burned down. And they never trained there again. So, but it was all related to the geology. It was too hard for them to play on.
I was going to say that's why Packers are so tough, but obviously they didn't do this.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah. So, anything else? Great to have questions. Thanks for your interest.
Well, thank you very much.
How's the weather out there?
It is pretty stormy.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's pretty stormy.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a question, but a good place to look for fossils is down the Mississippi River.
Sure. Another place to look is often your driveway. You know, if you've got gravel in your driveway, there's often fossils right there in front of your house if you look carefully. You know, there'll be little pieces, of course.
Neat stuff everywhere.
And I would say if you ever get to Madison, the geology on campus, the Geology Museum is really great. They have a great collection of fossils and rocks and minerals there. If you're ever on campus, that's a good place to look at stuff.
And the nest, is it nest?
Oh, there's a Macedon. Yeah, there's some big.
Our son goes to school in Platteville, so we actually just went to the mining museum.
Oh, the Platteville Mining Museum is great too.
Yeah.
Did you go underground and the?
No, it was too early and it was
yeah.
closed, but
Yeah. No, that's a great.
it's on the list. We'll
Yeah.
get down there.
Yeah, feel free to take. And I brought on the back table. You can take one of those. And on the back table, don't take the stuff on the back table, but there's some samples of rocks to look at, and I'll let those to the library to have.
Oh, thank you. We will certainly put those.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Great audience. Thank you.